Welcome back to Retraced Echoes. As always, I'm your host. My name is Bert. Now today we're going to be jumping into one of the most perplexing and chilling hauntings in American history. Now we're talking about the Bridgeport Poltergeist, which was located at 966 Lindley Street. Now, this tale, it's about a lot more than just ghostly apparitions. If anything, it's about a family's struggle with something beyond their understanding. But before we jump into that story, let's grab a quick little word from our social media guru, Sarah.
Hey everyone, Sarah here. Before we dive into today's eerie tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and follow us on our social media channels for exclusive content and updates. You can find us on all your favorite platforms, from Instagram to TikTok, and all the way over to Facebook. And if you're listening outside of YouTube, be sure to check us out there for the video version of today's episode. Lastly, if you have a haunting story you want us to cover on the podcast, head over to our website at www.retracedechoes.com. Once you're there, just click on Submit a Story.
Yeah, we definitely want to hear your stories. Our ultimate goal is to, if anything, bring some of our listener stories and have a life of it here on this podcast. And don't get me wrong, trust me, I love talking about these different hauntings that's known world round, but for the first time, I'm working with someone right now to bring their story to the forefront. And as a story out of the UK, I'm super excited to bring it to you guys. So definitely think about that. If you want to have your story told kind of in the format that I provide here, definitely, as Sarah said, jump over to the website and hit submit a story. But let's jump into our haunting for today. Now, the haunting at 966 Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut is, as I said earlier, probably one of the most well-documented cases of poltergeist activity ever. The Goodin family experienced terrifying phenomena, everything from objects moving on their own to strange noises, and even physical attacks. Out of curiosity, Sarah, what can you tell us about the haunting without digging too awful deep into the story?
Well, the Bridgeport Poltergeist case involved over 70 documented instances of paranormal activity. Witnesses included police officers, firefighters, and even reporters who saw furniture levitate, objects fly across rooms, and heard unexplained noises. There were also numerous reports of physical interactions, like people being pushed or scratched. As for the house today, it's still standing, but reports of hauntings have significantly decreased since the Goodin family moved out. However, locals still regard it as a spooky landmark, and some believe the spirits may still linger.
Our story today begins in a very modest 3-room house. Now, it's said that this house was built in 1923 for a shirt manufacturer, but our story truly begins with Jerry and Laura Goodin, who purchased the house in 1960. Now, just like all of the podcasts that I've produced here, it begins almost the same way, just a couple looking to create, if anything, a peaceful life together. Jerry had been a maintenance man for the last 23 years. He was very straightforward. A lot of people said that he was down to earth. He was not known for having his head in the clouds. Laura, she was a full-blooded Native American who grew up in a house where there wasn't any children that was her age, not even living nearby. And because of this, she had a really hard time making friends. But all of that said, her and Jerry was very compatible. They worked out very well. They got married and they welcomed their first son on Halloween of 1961. Now, he seemed like a perfectly healthy baby. That was all until one day when their neighbor pointed out that his head, it just always seemed to hang kind of down. Now, this is something that Laura had noticed, but she didn't put a whole lot of thought into it. In fact, she ended up talking to the doctor, and at first the doctor said, well, it's probably not something to worry about. Let's give it a little bit of time. But unfortunately, 6 months later, there was no change. They did some tests, and Jerry Jr. was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. Now, the Goodins, they spent nearly all of their time and all of their money on Jerry Jr. They did everything from ordering him a special chair to ordering leg braces, but he would only live to see the age of 6. He passed away just 3 days before his 7th birthday. Now, this naturally devastated the couple. To make things worse, as though things could be any worse, the day after the burial of their son, Laura needed to have a hysterectomy. Now, that was to remove a tumor that was leaving her unable to have any more children. The grief was absolutely unbearable. Think about this timeline just once again. We went through that very quickly. Brand new couple, they have their very first child. They don't really know what to expect. Their neighbor notices something that was unusual. Now, my guess is the neighbors probably had children. They was able to see their children and how they developed. They said, hey, you might want to get that checked out. Now, Laura had noticed this, but she didn't think it was a big deal. They go to the doctor, and the doctor gives them somewhat of some hope. It's probably fine. They go back 6 months later. They get diagnosed, or should I say their son gets diagnosed with cerebral palsy. He lives to be almost 7 years old, 3 days before his 7th birthday. He passes away. Now, right before that news, my guess is that I couldn't find exactly when, but Laura was diagnosed, or not diagnosed, but she was told she had a tumor, and she had to have a hysterectomy just 1 day after they put their son in the ground. Now they can't have another child. I couldn't even imagine what they would go through. Now, the Goodins, they kept a shrine to their son in the living room for about 6 months until they decided that a home without a child wasn't a home at all. So, they took down the shrine, and they decided probably the best thing for them to do is, since they couldn't have a child, is to look at possibly adopting a child. Now, they immediately fell in love with a 4.5-year-old that was a full-blooded Native American girl. Now, she was the youngest of a family of 9 and the only one of her siblings that was ever put up for adoption. The Goodin family welcomed this little girl right into their family as though she was their very own. Her name was Marcia, and unfortunately, due to the events that happened with their son and what they had going on, I think up here in their head, they became a little overprotective, and some would say to the point of contention. Now, Laura, she wouldn't let Marcia out of her sight. She would walk her to and from school every single day. She would refuse to let her play with any of the children. Now, this led to Marcia not really being able to have any friends. Now, when she was asked about this, Laura said, well, she didn't grow up with any friends, so she didn't see the need for them. She also said that she wasn't going to let Marcia out of her sight out of fear that she would just die. Now, this caused Marcia to kind of resent Laura. Things started to get really bad when Jerry's hours were cut back at work and Marcia had to transfer from a private school to a public school where she was relentlessly bullied. Think about when you were coming up in school. If you was having your mom walking you to and from school and you couldn't have any friends, that would take a pretty significant toll on any child. And in fact, I believe that would cause them to be bullied just as much as what Marcia was. Now, the kids will be kids, they say, but the kids would call her horrible names and make racist remarks about her Native American heritage. And one day, she was attacked and beaten by a group of boys, one of whom kicked her so hard that she needed to be placed in a pelvic brace. Now, Laura and Jerry did what I think any parent would want to do if they were capable of it. They immediately pulled her from school and decided homeschooling is the best way to go. Now, for Marcia, that is something that's, for me, it's hard to understand what the best thing for her to do would be. Obviously, she's got this bullying situation, and back then, What do you do? I mean, she's in a pelvic brace. Clearly, those boys was out to cause as much pain and suffering as they could. So you can't put her back in that environment. But in the same regard, they've been so overprotective. She has no friends. And now they're taking away any possibility of having someone outside of just the two of them. Now, Marcia, she wasn't the type to lash out. If anything, she kind of kept her emotions bottled inside. Now, the interesting thing about that is paranormal experts, they all kind of agree that this is a prime condition. This is the one thing that will cause the invitation of poltergeist activity. If it's not like a ghost or a spirit or entity or something like that, I think their thought process is it could possibly be just energy from a child. In fact, and I'd have to go and probably research some of this, but a lot of times they say it's teenage girls. If you look at the case of the Enfield poltergeist, is probably a prime example of this. And I can't remember what little girl it was, but we had covered that actually on our second podcast, one that I co-host with a friend of mine. His name is Nick. The name of the podcast is Deceptive Reality. But when we covered Enfield, one of the things that we talked about is teenage girls, they believe, can actually manifest like an energy to where you can pick things up. We've also covered some cases like, let's use for example, the Montauk Project, where they use children to, even in some occasions, open a portal. Now, obviously, that doesn't fit in line with the podcast that we're doing today, but it's kind of an interesting thought process when you look at there being something to do with children and what they're able to manifest with their own minds. In the very beginning, there was poltergeist activity that was happening with the family and they didn't even know it. So things would come up missing or they'd find it somewhere completely different. And a lot of times they would chalk it up with just, it was a coincidence, or I must have forgotten about it, or I must have put it there, or someone moved it. But in 1969, that was the first time they could point to something and go, that's not normal. They didn't have a good explanation for it. And it happened when the Hoffmans, now the Hoffmans were family friends of the Goodins, and they would oftentimes come over for like game nights or for other gatherings just to hang out. They had a daughter, Rosemarie, and Rosemarie was pretty close to the age of Marcia. In fact, it was probably the closest thing to a friend that Marcia had. Now, a lot of times the two girls, they would sit on opposite sides of the couch, and it was typically with a very awkward silence between the two, because Marcia, she wasn't around any kids. She had that one bad experience in school. But anyway, Rosemarie, she tried to make conversation. Marcia, she didn't really know what to say, so she remained silent. Now suddenly, the couch began to rumble ever so slightly. What was that? Rosemarie would ask. Now Marcia, she said nothing. In fact, she looked scared to death. The couch, it rumbled again. A little harder this time. Now both of the girls, they're looking at each other scared half to death. Rosemarie's end of the couch, it slowly rose up into the air 6 inches. And then it come crashing back down. The girls are screaming. The parents hear this from the kitchen and they rush right into the room. They hear this huge crash, girls screaming. Now, neither one of the frightened girls could articulate what happened. They had no clue how to even explain it. And somehow, I have no clue how, but the adults, they just brush it off as, well, the kids must have been roughhousing. But if you knew these two girls, they would just sit on the end of the couch saying nothing. So to hear this noise and then hear them screaming, It made absolutely no sense. Now, the good thing that came out of all this, if there is a good thing, is somehow what happened on that couch between those two girls sparked somewhat of an interaction between the two girls. They became closer. They even started playing out in the yard instead of just sitting on the couch in pure silence. Now, one afternoon, the Hoffmans came over to visit, and Rosemarie, she ran into Marcia's room and kind of found her sitting on the couch with her legs kind of crossed, rocking back and forth, talking slowly in a language that she didn't understand. "Marcia," Rosemary called out in a panicked voice. Marcia snapped out of it and looked at her friend. She explained that she had been talking to her grandfather, who was not very happy by the fact that the Goodins had taken her from her tribe. Now, for Rosemarie, who's hearing this, I can only assume what's going through her mind. Well, we was friends, but that's a little weird. Might not want to be a part of that. Now, as though that occurrence wasn't spooky enough, there's something that's going to happen that presents itself in a little bit more sinister light. Now, one night, there's a young boy and he's staying over the Goodins, and he wakes up, and around him, he sees hundreds of red eyes. Now, they're staring at him in all directions. The room is completely pitch black. Now, he described the eyes as glowing ominously, and it made him feel trapped and paralyzed with fear.
That's absolutely terrifying. Imagine waking up to something like that. It's no wonder the boy was so traumatized.
Oh, you best believe I would have been absolutely frightened out of my mind. It's one thing when a room's completely pitch black, but to then feel like you're surrounded, that would be pretty much horrific. Now, from 1971 to 1972, John kept getting woke up in the middle of the night. And the reason for that was he said that he would hear a loud pounding noise, and the best that he could describe was from the side of his house. It was like someone was beating on the side of his house. Now, this wasn't like a knock at the door. In fact, he would say that it was a deafening slam. Now, it would happen again and again and again. He could never identify where the sound was coming from. And he said it would happen night after night. Now, one thing that I oftentimes think about when we talk about all these different ghost stories or hauntings or possession that these families deal with, it always starts as typically a scratch and then a knock, and then it kind of escalates from there. In this case, there was the poltergeist activity. Now, typically that's not the first thing that would happen, so it makes me wonder, was it happening before and they didn't notice it? Or did the poltergeist activity occur first? But anyway, eventually, he would end up calling his friend, who was also his neighbor. His name was John, and John was a police officer for the Bridgeport Police Department. And John suggested that maybe they get a recording, and they was going to take that recording and show it to the police. Now, by a recording, what I mean is they would set up a tape recorder at like 3 a.m. and they would basically record audibly the pounding that was happening. Now, it would start in the kitchen, and it would be John and Jerry in there with the tape recorder, so they're both hearing it, and it would follow them from room to room to room. Now, they would take that tape and they would present it to the police department, who they would do that along with the fire department and other various city officials, and they investigate, but they could not figure out what the cause of the pounding was. Now, this pounding continued through 1974. That's when things escalated yet again. As though things can't get much worse at this point, right? It was an early autumn evening. It was Jerry and Laura. They're sitting in the front room. All of a sudden, Laura jumps out of her seat. She's pointing to the window. Jerry, he turns his attention, and on the other side of the window, they see a disembodied hand. Now, they both run out the front door. They're trying to figure out, where did this come from? Is there someone there? They could never find a reason for it. Now, on another night, Laura heard 3 distinct knocks at the front door. When she opened it, no one was there. But when she looked down, she saw 2 wet footprints on the stoop. Now, I've heard tales where an entity will knock 3 times. When you open the door, that's an open invitation. Now, I don't know if that's what applies in this story, but in some folklore, that's allowing something to come in. Now, the chilling part about this entire story is that when she looked down at those footprints, they wasn't of shoes or boot marks or anything like that. They were of bare feet. And on top of that, it was a completely dry evening. Early autumn transitions into late autumn. November 21st, yet again, things grew worse. Now, Jamie and Janet, who was John the next door neighbor's wife and 14-year-old daughter, they was hanging out with Laura and with Marcia. Now, as they're sitting there talking and trying to catch up, they hear a crash come from the master bedroom. So they do what anyone would do. They jump up and they rush into the bedroom. And what they saw made absolutely no sense. Now, back then, windows had multiple panes. Typically, there was a pane on the inside, a pane of glass on the inside, one on the outside. The pane that was on the inside, it was completely shattered, but the outside pane, completely untouched. On top of that, nobody was in the room. There was no reason for that to have occurred. Now, the very next day, Jerry, Laura, and Marcia, they're all sitting in the living room. They're watching TV, and they hear a very strange noise coming from the master bedroom, the same one that had the broken glass. So they get up and they go to investigate, and what they saw made no sense. They saw the window shade had been rolled all the way up and the curtain had been flung from the very rod. So Jerry, who's trying to make sense of all this, he replaces everything the way that it was, and then right there in front of them, they watched again as the curtain was flung from the very wall. Somehow, don't ask me how, Jerry started joking. He's trying to lighten the mood, and he says, well, whatever it is, doesn't like curtains. Problem is, nobody laughed at that, Jerry. That wasn't very funny. Now, typically when we talk about hauntings, whether it be from personal experience or doing the research that I've done, we always talk about there being activity and then there's dead time. Okay, bad choice of words. Moments of quietness. We're not going to use the terminology dead time. So in this case, on November the 21st, the first event happened. November the 22nd, second thing happened. Now on the 23rd, the family, they basically say, you know what? We need to take a day trip. We need to get our mind off of all of this stuff. Let's have some fun. So they go out on this day trip and they return. They had a blast. And Jerry goes in and he finds Marcia's TV, which was high up on a shelf, sitting face down on Marcia's bed. Now, all the cords and the antenna wires, they're hanging off the back. He's completely confused. He's like, I need Laura to see this. She's never going to believe it. So he walks into the kitchen. As he walks in, from the sink, he sees these dishes coming out of the sink and flying up into the air. And then they start flying around the room, smashing into the walls. Now, while all of this is going on, Laura walks to the doorway just in time to see these knives floating out of the knife block and flying towards Jerry. She calls out to him. She's like, Jerry. He ends up ducking just in time. Otherwise, those knives would have hit him. Now, just when you're like, this can't get any crazier, the kitchen table starts to raise off of the floor. It flips over, which sends all the groceries crashing into the wall. Laura hears something behind her, so she turns around. to see the 300-pound refrigerator hovering one entire foot off of the floor. Now, immediately after that, now, again, this is happening thing after thing after thing after thing. They hear a sound. They look over. There's this heavy wooden TV stand, which is pretty much right next to the sink. It starts to tilt over, which then caused the TV to fall off the edge, which smashed down on Laura's bare foot, busting open two of her toes. Now she's screaming in pain. Jerry scoops her up, tells Marcia to get into the car, and then he takes Laura to the emergency room. Now, with all of this going on, they're leaving the house. They're still seeing these things happening inside their home from the window. Just when I feel like the story can't get any better, like you all are probably looking at me like I'm completely crazy. This isn't my story. Okay, this is a story that was told. The following day, there's two police officers, Carl and Joe, that's out on patrol. Now, they receive a call regarding unusual activity that's happening at a certain house on Lindley Street. Now, what house do you reckon that is? So, they arrive and they find the Goodins with several other family members, including their fellow officer, his next door neighbor and friend John, who is freaking out. Now, they all explain to the officers that the couch had lifted off the floor, slammed back down, dishes were still flying around and smashing. First off, how many dishes did they have? But the refrigerator had lifted off the floor, bumped into John, and the recliners were violently reclining and unreclining in rapid succession. Like, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but things get worse. These officers, they enter the house. One of the officers picks up the TV, puts it back on the TV stand. It's there for just one moment. And then, to his astonishment, he watches it float back up and then swing from left to right just like a pendulum. Now, he looked around to see if maybe there was something that was, if anything, propping it up. Wires. Something that would cause this to happen, like any rational person. Now, the officers witnessed many other, what we'll call unusual things. So they called for backup. Now, one of the policemen, Officer Leroy Lawson, in fact, he witnessed a crucifix pull off of the wall, nail and all, and then it was thrown directly at his chest where it bounced off. Now, much like myself, Officer Leroy, he said, "That's it. I'm out of here." Now, several other officers, they arrived along with the firefighters, and there was, I believe, 10 altogether. And they all witnessed everything from the TV, rising up and flipping over. Now, with all of this, there's a crowd of people that begins gathering outside the house as word is obviously going around. This place is haunted. Mary, who was another neighbor, made her way through the crowd and into the house. Now, supposedly, Mary was a psychic medium, and she wanted to test the theory that she could use her powers to kind of understand what was going on. And her thought process was that Marcia was unconsciously an agent for all of this poltergeist activity. So what she was saying was, because of Marcia, all of these things was happening. Now, Mary decided to run some tests, and unfortunately those tests came back as unsuccessful. But she also had another genius idea. Just the year prior, in 1973, Mary had performed a seance in Harrisville, Rhode Island, with none other than the famed paranormal investigation duo of Ed and Lorraine Warren. Now, as soon as she left the Goodins, she picked up the phone and she gave them a call. She filled them in on everything that was going on inside the house, and they took a pretty immediate interest. So, what do you do when you're Ed and Lorraine Warren? They jumped in the car from Monroe and drove all the way to Bridgeport. Now, as they arrived, Ed had to park about 4 blocks away due to the thousands of people who was surrounding the house. They were just trying to get, if anything, a glance. They want to see what was going on the inside, peeking through the windows and through the doors. Now, the Warrens, they brought along a priest by the name of Father Charbonneau. You've probably heard of him from other cases, as well as a 21-year-old seminary student by the name of Paul Eno. Now, they began to interview everybody, police officers, firefighters, basically anyone who's seen anything. And the Goodin family, they was welcoming the help. They just kind of want to get to the bottom of everything. Now, Marcia, she even remarked that it was fun to have so many people inside the house. Now, it's always great to have those stories from firefighters and police officers, but there was a gentleman who had came forward. He said that the Goodins babysitted him when he was just a little boy, and he came forward with all of his experiences also. He revealed that when he would stay inside the house, he was a witness to many terrifying phenomena, and that followed him all the way through to now him being an adult. And some of the things that he would talk about is they used to, when he would be over there, especially if he'd stay the night, he would have this portable rollout bed. It was actually a bed set, and it would be sitting in one room, in one place. He would go to sleep. He would wake up, and he would be in a completely different room. Now, the crazy part of all this is the rollout bed, once they had it set up, it was too big to even go through some of the doorways, which made absolutely no sense. It left him as well as the Goodins baffled, and it left him scared to death. Now, when I was researching this case, specifically this guy, something struck me from last week's podcast when we were at the Sally house. And one of the things that came up at the Sally house, they had said, when you leave a haunted house, the assumption is that you're leaving whatever it is behind. It's not going to come with you. And much like the Sally house, this gentleman had said that he personally has been battling these demons for the last 50 years. It's basically been a relentless torment for him. I'm not going to include his information in this story or this podcast. Honestly, I don't think that he would want to deal with any of this. He's just got too many things going on in his personal life, his professional life, and I don't think it's fair for me as a podcast to divulge what he has going on to the point to where people might try to contact him, if that makes sense. But one thing that I did find interesting was that he captured some audio recordings of what he's calling demonic voices, and he's saying that those are still haunting him. And he gave those audio files to an expert, and they analyzed the recordings and confirmed that those voices were genuine. They wasn't manipulated, they wasn't fabricated, and it added, if anything, to me, another layer of credibility. Now, was it demons from this house? Heck if I know. He said that he did not have any experiences, though, prior to being babysat inside that house. Now, during one particular encounter with what he's calling, again, the demon, he said that it communicated to him and that the demon said that it was about 75% of the job had been done. Can you imagine? I mean, this chilling message suggests that they've been somewhat successful in spreading whatever malevolence they're trying to provide inside this house, and that's as of now. Even though activity is said to have slowed down, according to this guy and what the demons through him is saying, they're not done. But either way, let's get back to the story. So Ed grabs Paul and says, hey, I want you to stay with Marcia. I think part of the reason was he wanted to make sure that she was safe, but the second part was he wanted to make sure that she wasn't causing any of this paranormal activity intentionally. So Ed's kind of looking around. He's seeing that this activity is kind of going crazy. So he ends up calling the police superintendent and informing him that there is definitely poltergeist activity happening inside the house. Now, during the course of the investigation, Ed and Lorraine and police officers, firefighters, they would see everything from the recliners rising all the way up to the ceiling. The craziest one is they said that the family cat was swearing and making off-color remarks to some of the police officers. I can only imagine. I find it funny that it was just the police officers. But they would see furniture moving. They said they would see ashtrays that would levitate up into the air and then explode. And on top of that, they was hearing mysterious sounds. Oh, I should also mention, when it comes to the cat, Ed and Lorraine, and there was a series of other people, said that they heard the cat singing Jingle Bells. What an interesting choice of song coming. That might be the scariest thing that I would have seen or heard. I mean, it was November. It was almost Christmas time. The cat was just getting ready. He's getting prepped. Now, Lorraine Warren, she would experience, that's not funny. The cat things got me. Anyway, Lorraine, she would experience bouts of nausea whenever she would enter inside of Marcia's room. And on top of that, she was sitting at the kitchen table, and it was her, Paul Eno, and the Goodins. And while they was talking, they was looking at her hands, and right here on her wrist, they noticed that there was a burn mark that was occurring, and there was no rhyme or reason for any of that. Now, on top of that, you got to remember, now the Warrens are there. They're world-renowned investigators in the realm of paranormal. And this crowd that we talked about not that long ago that was forming, it was growing to levels that was inconceivable. It got so bad that the police had to set up a barricade on the outside just to keep them from trying to sneak inside or to sneak over even to the window to try to catch a glimpse of whatever was going on inside the house. At this point, they're trying to keep some of it contained. Now, Father Charbonneau and Ed, they absolutely believed that they was dealing with a demon and they had to perform an exorcism on the house. Now, the problem is the church did not agree. Now, despite the lack of cooperation from the church, Ed and Lorraine decided that they needed everything that they would typically bring to an exorcism as far as the items that they needed. So they drove all the way back to Monroe. Now, while they are gone, it's the Goodins, there's Paul, and the Goodins had a family friend. Her name was Barbara Carter. Now, while they're sitting there and they can clearly see all this stuff going on, they saw 4 separate entities. They described it as being smoky figures just appeared. Now, as soon as that happened, they was gone. They was out. They're like, nope. Now, Paul, he ends up running over to the neighbor's house, and he calls the Warrens and he tells them everything that just happened. Now, could you imagine being the neighbor for just a moment, hearing knock, knock, knock? Hey, can I borrow your phone? Just saw some demons come out of the ground from next door. Now, Father Charbonneau and Ed believed that they was dealing 100% with a demon and that the house had to have an exorcism. Now, unfortunately for them, the church did not agree. But despite the lack of cooperation between the church and Ed and Lorraine, Father Charbonneau and Paul, Ed and Lorraine decided they needed to go back to Monroe to grab all the items that was necessary to perform the exorcism. Now, while they're gone, you've got the Goodins, you've got Paul, and a family friend. They're all hanging out inside the house together. The family friend, her name was Barbara Carter. And while they're sitting there and they're talking, from the very ground, they saw the form of 4 smoky figures, 4 separate entities that come up from the ground. Now, with seeing that, they're out. They're gone. In fact, Paul runs next door to the neighbor's house, and He borrows their phone. He has to call the Warrens and tell them what's going on. Let's stop for just a second. Imagine if you're the neighbors. Knock, knock, knock. Hey, just need to borrow your phone. Just saw 4 demons come from the ground over at your neighbor's house. How crazy is that? But anyway, they return to the house about 9 o'clock, 9:15, and they go down into the basement. It's Father Charbonneau. His ideas, they needed to begin to bless the house. Now, while they're down there, the father's looking around, and out the corner of his eye, he sees this black mass, and it seems to be kind of in the corner of the basement. Now, he's walking up to it because he's trying to confirm this is a shadow that's on the wall. But what he found was the shadow wasn't on the wall. The dark mass was just a few foot from the wall. He could completely walk around it. And on top of that, he said he passed his hand through it and he could feel almost like I think he described it as like a cold mist.
That's scary. It really says something about the presence of something paranormal in that house.
I think so. I mean, when was the last time you passed your hand through something like that? You know what I'm saying? I don't think I'd been able to handle it. Now, I believe this is the exact moment that for the father, he understood this is clearly a demonic presence. This is clearly something that we're going to have to exorcise. Ed and Lorraine already knew that this was a thing. Now, I'm going to call this the turn in the story. It's November 26th. What the police department was doing was leaving a police officer inside the house, typically at least one, usually more. This evening on the 26th, it was Mike Costello's turn to be posted inside the house. And he's sitting inside the living room with Marcia. She's in a recliner, and he starts getting this skeptical, very suspicious thought process with her. He just felt like something was a little off. Now, while they're sitting there, 2 officers come to the door. They're knocking. Jerry decides to get up with Laura to go get the door, and then they start talking to the officers. Now, while they're doing that, Officer Costello, he's paying attention, but he's not looking directly at Marcia. And he notices that she starts kind of extending her leg out, and she ends up pushing on the TV, and she pushes it just a few inches with her toe. Now, like all children do, she kind of starts looking around, and she sees Officer Costello staring at her. And then she did what every child does that gets caught doing something that they probably shouldn't do. She got that gotcha look, and she smiled. Now, he quickly noticed. He was already skeptical to begin with. He ends up calling the police superintendent, who was already eager to get this fiasco done. They didn't want this in their town. And he told him, you know what? I think this thing is an entire hoax that's being perpetrated by this little girl. That was the turning point in the story. I think once you believe that one thing is a complete lie, it's a fabrication, nobody wants anything to do with you. And on top of that, now you've lost all credibility. So for Marcia, she would cause a series of events that was about to occur that for many turns a story into a fabrication. So the superintendent, he's done. He tells Costello, hey, you need to go interview Marcia. You need to get her to admit to all of it. So it's Costello. There's another officer by the name of Del Toro. They end up pulling Marcia into a separate room, and they start conducting an interview. Now, Marcia, she did admit to many of the occurrences that was happening inside the house, everything from the moving TV to the cat's voice. She said that she was even toying with the recliners, but to make things worse, she said that she saw Lorraine Warren go inside of a bathroom. Now, remember, we talked about this earlier. She had that blister that was forming over top of her wrist from a burn. She said that she saw Lorraine inside the bathroom intentionally putting her wrist underneath scalding hot water in the sink and burning herself on purpose. Now, again, you got to remember, this is Ed and Lorraine Warren. They are world renowned. But when you're world renowned, you got your fair share of skeptics. Now, with all of this information, the police basically left the house and they officially ruled it a hoax. They're like, none of this is real. This is when things went from bad to worse. Without the police there, the crowds became unruly. At this point, they estimated that crowd was like 4,000 people. The size of this house, it's so small, the fact that there's 4,000 people that's now piled around this house, they were going on the lawn. That's crazy. Then on top of it, you got news reporters that's now saying this is a hoax. The police left. Clearly, none of it's true. They're blaming Ed and Lorraine Warren, accusing them of drugging the family with drugs inside of candy. They're saying that this is causing all these hallucinations. I'm not saying that Ed and Lorraine Warren is perfect. Not even saying that some of this is not suspicious. But candy laced with drugs? I mean, come on. That's part of the problem, though. A lot of people like to give Ed and Lorraine a tough time. They're not even here to defend themselves anymore. I don't know what to believe about Ed and Lorraine. There's obviously, Marcia was caught doing this thing where she was pushing the TV and then she admitted to all these things. One of the things that I don't ever see when I look at the research, and no one's ever brought this up that I found, if the demon's doing all this and the demon can take over a person and speak through that person, we've seen this in haunting after haunting, who's to say that while being interviewed, the demon doesn't go into Marcia and then admit to everything so that the police would leave? Why has no one brought up that point of view? I think it's plausible. I think it's even possible. Now, the family had a hard time leaving the house. In fact, again, you got these 4,000 people all over the place. As they're trying to leave, Marcia's leaving. Someone grabs her pocket and rips it right off of her shirt. On another occasion, there's two guys. They get charged with arson. They're trying to burn the house down. Now, luckily, someone saw some smoke coming up. They saw a little bit of fire and they extinguished it before it got out of hand. But the two men said that they were claiming that they were trying to get rid of the house and all the evil that was happening inside the house. Now, after that, you got people trying to burn the house down, for goodness sakes. The police reestablished the perimeter just to keep the family safe, but they wasn't entertaining any further claims about paranormal activity. Now, Ed and Lorraine Warren, I think it's only fair to say, they denied any type of claims of a hoax. They said, and I don't necessarily disagree with them, they said, no young child weighing 70 pounds could have created such a hoax in full view of police officers, firemen, and definitely not for that length of time. Now, again, if a demon would have went inside of Marcia when she was pushing that TV, again, we have to understand that demons are considered tricksters. Who's to say that that wasn't all orchestrated by the demon? They clearly had escalation that was occurring inside the house. That's just something that I keep coming back to. Now, despite the Warrens saying that they had nothing to do with this, and it was highly unlikely that Marcia would have been able to do any of it also, the Goodins was like, you have to go. You got to leave, and you got to leave right now. Now, eventually, the hype kind of died down, but things didn't get any better for the family. Think about it. you've become the center of all this news, and you got all these world-renowned paranormal experts that's coming in, and Ed's a demonologist. The problem is they had to go back to regular life. Now, Jerry goes back to work and he's harassed. On top of that, the family wasn't even financially able to replace many of the items that was broken during any of these incidences. So if they was trying to create this, whatever this was, this fake haunting, why would they break all of their stuff? That also doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And on top of all of that, the paranormal activity, it didn't even stop. Now, to try to help their situation, and I think that this is very common when we talk about hauntings, the family, they just said, yep, it was a hoax. 100% a hoax. We faked it all. I think they was just trying to get the crowd to chill out. The problem is, even though they're saying, yep, it was a hoax, this was us, the fact that the haunting was still going on, who do they turn to now? They kicked Ed and Lorraine out. They're getting ridiculed in public. The only way that they see that maybe eventually people will get bored with is by saying they caused it. They're in their house. The furniture still continued to float. There were still objects that was smashing against the walls. And the new officers who had not been inside the house, they were now witnessing strange things that was happening just like they were before. But then they don't want to say anything when they go back to the police station, because then they would be ridiculed. Well, that's just a trick. How did you fall for that trick? What a crazy, strange series of events. And how do you get out of whatever that situation is? Now, eventually things started to slow down, if anything, just a little bit. It's like mid-December, so not super far from when all this stuff was starting to occur. The crowds had died down. The family decided they wanted to have a little bit of a getaway. They wanted to take their mind off of everything, and they wanted to go to New York. They was replacing some of the things in the house that was broken, the expensive stuff, and some of the stuff that they could salvage, they tried to salvage. They left the house compared to what it was before in pretty, I'm going to say pristine condition. I mean, clearly it probably wasn't pristine, but it was about as good as they're going to get it with the things that had occurred. But when they returned, they found that it was almost all completely destroyed yet again. The furniture was overturned. There was a statue that was on the ground with its thumbs removed. At this point, Laura believed that whatever this entity was, it was trying to kill them. Now, in the meanwhile, there was another paranormal investigation team that came in. This situation is tricky because where do they go from here? Now, this investigation team, they looked at things from a scientific investigation standpoint. Now, some of the things that I said earlier about what happened, they was able to look at a little bit differently. They investigated and interviewed the family with Ed Warren. They even talked to the inspector, the supervisor that was at the police station that was responsible for closing the investigation, the same person that declared it a hoax. And with everyone interviewed, the assessment came back that nobody really believed that it was a hoax. They said that Officer Clark had been pressured to close the case by his superintendent and basically said to pressure Marcia into this admission. That way, the police wasn't getting this scrutiny because you got to remember, they're saying that they're seeing these things also, and now they're taking their rap for it. Now, the entire investigation, it was done about January of 1975, and it was even provided with a preliminary report. Now, this was in Duke University, and the report was entitled A Perplexing Poltergeist. What an interesting turn of events. You've got all these things that's going on. They determine it's a hoax. Then you have experts come in and say it's really not a hoax. And then the paper ends up in a university, Duke University of all places. In my opinion, and I know it doesn't mean a whole lot, I believe that the Goodins experienced some type of, if anything, for them, terrifying phenomena. I believe they saw objects moving on their own. I believe they heard strange noises. I believe that they was physically attacked. Again, you don't have a hoax that has this many people. Marcia is not talented enough. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think she's talented enough to have faked everything. And regardless of the bad rap that the Warrens, they have at this point, it's funny that nobody had a problem with them as much when they were alive. It's after they die and they can't defend themselves that now everyone has a problem with them. Again, I'm not saying that things were not hoaxed, that things were not changed. I just don't believe it's to the extent that everyone wants everyone else to believe that it was. All of you out there in podcast land, you've heard the story. Maybe you know more of the story. There are some things that I left out. What do you think? Do you think that it's very possible that all of these people, from police to firefighters to people that's outside of the house, do you believe that they're able to fake all of these things? Do you think that even something as crazy as the cat singing Jingle Bells? Listen, if I was a cat and I could sing, Jingle Bells probably be my bang zone too. What says you in the comments down below? Tell me. I would love to know what your theory on all of this is. But either way, as we wrap up another spine-chilling episode of Retraced Echoes, we've journeyed through all the eerie events that's occurred at this house, whether it be, the lines between the supernatural and the explainable. For me, they were blurred. And they were blurred in the most unsettling of ways. Now, whether you believe in ghostly whispers or the power of suggestion, one thing is for sure. Bridgeport, it will never, ever forget the Goodin family ordeal. Sarah, why don't you tell them about the other podcast that we've got?
Absolutely. If you're enjoying today's episode of Retraced Echoes, make sure to check out Bert's other podcast, Deceptive Reality. It's your go-to destination for unsolved mysteries and perplexing phenomena. Join Bert and Nick as they dive into chilling tales like the Shag Harbor UFO incident and the Enfield Poltergeist. Also, don't forget to follow both podcasts on all your favorite social media for updates and exclusive content. Also, make sure you turn in those stories over on our website.
Absolutely. We definitely want to hear about these stories. Also, please check out the other podcast. Wherever you're listening to your podcast, please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed this podcast. Also, wherever you're listening to your podcast, if you've not checked out the YouTube channel, definitely check out the YouTube channel. We like to put the video version of the podcast up. I've got some other things kind of working in the background, but if your fridge starts floating or your cat starts chatting, it might be time to call in the experts.